So this is like a big one. I think it's going to be both technical and interesting.
David Taylor is the CEO of EtherFuse.
Our mission statement is to improve financial access to any investment on chain.
A fintech company bridging TradFi and DeFi by putting real-world assets like sovereign debt on chain.
What was it for you when you decided to start EtherFuse that was especially intriguing about Mexico?
The cost of credit in Mexico is like 45% right now. Financial access is half. So we just stepped back and we looked at the world and we said, what is the biggest nation in the world that we could approach the regulators there and say, we're qualified and we want to create the future here.
With users in over 32 countries, he's leading a global push for a more inclusive and transparent financial future.
I think if we're not too early, you will see the world move on chain, and we might be a big part of that.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the reDeFined podcast. Jeremy, how you doing today?
Hey, feeling excited, feeling pumped for the topic. Megan, how you doing?
I am excellent, thank you. What do we got on tap today? What's our topic du jour?
So this is like a big one. I think it's going to be both technical and interesting and economic. So we're going to talk a little bit about putting bonds on chain with an incredible guest, David Taylor. David, how you doing, man?
I'm doing great. Thank you all for having me. Really appreciate it. And glad to learn more and talk more about putting real assets on chain.
You've been doing this really interesting work, maybe just like 2 minutes on kind of the business you do, and so we can get some context before we talk about what sovereign debt's going to look like on chain.
I'm a co-founder and CEO of EtherFuse. EtherFuse, our mission statement is to improve financial access to any investment on chain to everyone in the world. You know, there's a lot of limiting factors and obstacles for people to have safe and secure access to investments and secure options. And we have primarily started with sovereign debt, so putting bonds on chain. Historically, we decided about 2 years ago that Mexico would be the best place to do that. Incentives were aligned, and so we are operated out of and incorporated in Mexico City. And we do provide access to those services on chain.
I'm blown away on what like that's going to mean on chain, but I think like, you know, it's a topic that's like very relevant right now, just generally around sovereign debt and, you know, national bonds. So like, can you maybe break down our economic 101 on like, how does it work off chain for, you know, today, if you're doing, you know, national debt, which in the US is, I guess, a big deal. And I assume it's in Mexico as well. So like what's happening there just in the physical era?
So in our world that we all exist in, the main fundraising mechanism for a sovereign nation or a country like the United States is to issue a bond or a treasury note. And breaking it down to, you know, what anybody can understand is the US government will say, or a sovereign nation will say, hey, if you give me $100 and hold it for 3 months, I will give you, and let me have it for 3 months. At the end of 3 months, I will give you $100 back plus some interest. And that interest is the rate at which your money is accruing. And the maturity date is the length of time that you've committed to give that government that money. And it is, you know, I think widely known as the safest, soundest investment that exists today, which is taking debt from a sovereign nation.
And Dave, who's typically buying that today?
I mean, I got one when I was like 5 from my grandpa or whatever.
Yeah.
Like a T-bill.
Yeah.
I think it was like a $50 T-bill.
Yeah. Today, you know, we're trying to change this. Part of what we do is we're trying to change this. But today, you see institutions, 401ks, companies, banks, anybody who wants to like balance, you know, an asset or their books with some collateral. If you looked at like the distribution of purchasers today, private persons is in the States like 1.5%. If you go to Mexico, it's like 2%. So direct ownership of sovereign debt is really, really low. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It's complicated. We put barriers in front of it. But for the most part, right now, it's you access it through institutions. And then as a private person, you kind of can get access through different ways, like mutual funds and ETFs and things like that.
And does the government have an interest in who holds those bonds? Do they want more access to citizens?
Yes, I think the governments all around the world have tried to crack the nut of how do we incentivize direct ownership of bonds. In the States, we have Treasury Direct. They're really trying to figure out how do we get people just to buy from us directly. And if you think about it, like when they buy through ETFs, when they buy through funds, there's people in the middle with management fees, and those are unnecessary. So the government has tried really hard to figure out, the governments, I guess I would say, figure out a way that we can inspire direct bond ownership. It is pretty easy, actually, but I just don't think it's in our wheelhouse of things that we do. And in Mexico as well, they are really trying to figure out with CETES Directo, how do we get people to buy it directly?
And I think most of us know this is like some kind of blend in our portfolio, right? Like, so, a lot of bonds are blended, across, other sort of higher performing assets. So, there's some ratio of, okay, I'm in equities here, I'm in bonds here, right? In long duration. And presumably if the government keeps printing money, they want us to keep buying their bonds, right?
A-
So,
Absolutely, yeah. Usually when we're talking about, the debt that a government owes, we're primarily talking about a lot of these bills that they've issued, and
right,
it's a
right.
looming payments hanging over our governments.
Yeah, I think the current issue is like the amount to service the debt in the US is now just ballooning, right? And so they're going to have to do some kind of version of that.
It's pretty incredible. It's pretty insane, I guess I would say. We're actually not that bad compared to some other places too. Like Argentina's improving, but there have been some pretty wildly out of balance interest payments on the debt that countries have, and we're moving in it. Not that I'm an expert in this space, but my personal opinion is the current trajectory of the U.S. is not in a good direction. It's not moving in a good direction, but it looks like we might try to fix some of that pretty soon. Maybe, I don't know.
Let's unpack then kind of this question around why Mexico. You're sitting, I think, joining us from somewhere in California, in the
Yes.
sunny part of the U.S. And there has been some momentum, really, in the past year in particular, kind of, I think, on the U.S. side around tokenization of U.S. treasuries, and BlackRock and Franklin Templeton and some of these big institutions, right, have stepped into that space. But what was it for you when you decided to start EtherFuse that was especially intriguing about Mexico, and why was that the place you decided to start?
We've been thinking about this quite a long time. I think you're starting to see people talk about it. Not enough still, by the way, but you're starting to see people talk about this today. But we started this process 3 years ago. And 3 years ago, or 2.5 to 3 years ago, no one wanted to say what they were doing was a security. Everyone was trying to say this isn't a security; it's a something else.
And that's because of the SEC and kind of the lack of clarity around crypto governance
Yeah,
and regulation.
and it was pretty clear a year ago. The strategy was just create chaos and hope, like not have anyone be sure of what they can or can't do. And we take a lot of risk, I would say, in being able to be financially penalized, but we don't take any criminal risk. So we would never do anything that would.
It's a
Uh,
good life strategy.
exactly. We wanted to be upfront about what we were doing. We think these things are securities, and we view them as real assets and real value creation tools. And so we didn't think the US would be a place that we could have a real discussion and get good feedback and build something legally. And, looking back in hindsight, we were right. If we would have started and been here, we'd have run out of money in legal and had no real clear guidance on what we were doing wasn't going to hurt us pretty bad, potentially criminally too. And so we just stepped back and we looked at the world and we said, what is the biggest nation in the world that is the most incentivized to adopt technologies related to the blockchain? That we could approach the regulators there and say, this is new. We're qualified to bring this to this nation, and we want to create the future here. We looked at a lot of places, but back then it was primarily driven by flows of money. And so you looked at remittances. And so the top three at the time were China, India, and Mexico. We didn't think China would be too open to us coming there and building, a mechanism to fundraise for China. And I've done work in India before. India is also pretty defensive as far as from foreigners coming in and doing things. So additionally, Mexico is a great place. Mexico was a lot. We are a lot like Mexicans and U.S. persons are a lot alike. Believe it or not, we have similar cultures, and they're very open to, I would say, a foreigner coming in and innovating. Mexico had a lot of unique characteristics that would benefit the people there. So the cost of credit in Mexico is like 45% right now. Financial access is like half people in Mexico don't even have a bank account. And so we felt we could make a compelling argument to the leadership there that bringing this product to Mexico would benefit Mexicans. And that was a crucial kind of impact that we would need to make to be able to do what we do.
Is the thinking there that, you may not have access to banking services, but as you've said earlier, this is one of the most secure assets you can buy. It's giving you, a nice yield. um, it's backed by the government, and so small individual retail investors can put their money into something like this, and it's sort of akin to a savings account, not intermediated by a bank, and where all that yield is flowing to them versus to intermediaries and third parties. Is that fair?
Absolutely. Our product specifically, we call it a stable bond, and we made up that name. So if you don't like it, let's talk about it. Maybe we'll change it. But we just wanted to convey that it's the same interface of the stable coin, but the underlying asset is a bond, and we pass that yield on back to the user. If you look at Mexico, all you need is a phone to have a stable bond, and you need an ID to pass KYC and things like that, of course. But you don't need to go through a bureaucratic process to open a bank account, which in Mexico, even for someone with lawyers, takes 3 to 6 months, which is incredibly insane. It took us a long time to get set up. And, in Mexico, if you're looking at it from the government's perspective, most Mexicans still use the dollar, which benefits their government zero. So if we can create a CETES-backed stable bond, we put power of a credit, the essential same fundamental power that a credit account gives you, in the hands of every person in Mexico. And the assets backing that benefit Mexicans in Mexico. So it's the main fundraising mechanism for Mexico to improve their country. And so if we can replace the ease of use in the interface of a stable coin and access, but do it in a way that benefits both Mexicans and Mexico, we think it will be a success. And if we can convey that, we think that they will say yes to us.
How does it work? Like a typical bond, those gets sold on the bond market, so are you guys buying actually Mexican bonds and then digitizing that process, or kind of where do you as a, sort of digitally native on-chain interface work with the government?
So the work with the government is done. Basically, we interfaced with their SEC. So it's called the CBV of Mexico. We applied to actually enter a sandbox where we would work under their guidance to bring these products to the country. And we made the claim that these were securities. And the outcome of that would have been, if they agreed that they were security, they'd let us enter into a sandbox, and they would tell us how to use them. And the way they give us a short-term monopoly, so like 4 years or something like that. After 2 years of back and forth, we got 200 pages of written interpretation from the CMEV that, as designed, our protocol does not meet the criteria for security and can be regulated under these policies. So we kind of ended up with the best of both worlds, where it's not a security in their eyes, but we also understand how we could build and promote it and operate in Mexico legally. Now, how it works is you give someone $1 or a peso of fiat, and that issuer gives you a token. They take that dollar and they put it in a bank account. Now, the portfolio of the asset backing that is generally it depends what you're looking at, but let's say USDC. USDC keeps about a quarter of that in cash, and then they put about 75% of the rest in bonds. And so the difference between us is we put 100% of it in bonds, and we pass the yield on back to you, and we keep a small amount, like anywhere from 0.25% to 1.5%. So our protocol is essentially converting USDC or fiat into a token, and then managing those funds, taking those funds and creating the collateral on the back end. And so we're talking right now about Mexico, but our regulatory runway is for any asset. So today we have 5 products. We have Brazilian short-term treasuries, stable bonds, UK gilts, European bonds, US treasuries, and Mexican treasuries.
So I assume, because of that, you're actually holding for the duration, whereas like a stable coin, is a more liquid product. In this case, it's like holding a digital version of the treasury bill where you do need to hold for the duration, correct?
It is, but we still have, I guess, innovated upon it where we give you the same liquidity. The cautionary tale is in the worst case scenario, absolute worst case scenario, you would have to hold to the like a 7-day duration. We use short term treasuries. So taking our Mexican product, they're weekly treasuries. We also have liquidity on both ends to buy and sell it. For the most part, you can immediately buy or sell one. In the early stages, we just created like an ephemeral bond that was exactly like a bond where you'd buy it, you'd hold it, you'd give it back to us. But we realized why people buy ETFs instead of directly. You asked this question before, like, why don't people buy directly? Well, a lot of people don't like to do things. They don't like to manage like maturity dates, right? And so we improved our protocol where as you're holding the token, the underlying asset just reinvests. So our stable bonds are actually compounding interest vehicles. So if you bought 100 pesos worth of CETES from us, or even $100 worth of USTRY, so this US Treasury backed vehicles, and you hold it, every time it expires, we just reinvest the principal plus the interest. And so as you're holding it, it's increasing in value like a checking account. And when you want to sell it, you can sell it.
Like, who buys these? I think the stat I saw in the US is it's effectively like a third foreign buyers, but 70% plus of US buyers, much of which is institutions. But then there's also the government buys it, which is its own kind of like, rabbit hole, is how 20% is 20% of all T bonds actually owned by the government, which is fascinating. But so it's like Mexico buying your, stable bond, like, or are these institutions or businesses or what?
Right now, so our stable bond distribution is pretty interesting. We have about, I would say, purchasers from 45 different countries around the world. And what surprised us is a majority of them were outside of the countries from the assets we're issuing. So we're seeing a lot of interest in people who don't have access to, say, like investing in emerging market using us. Also, like, the crypto space is full of a lot of interesting type of investments, primarily risky. Even if you look at like stablecoin yields, the APYs they promise aren't true. Appreciate, percentages per year. They're just like a slim look at what it's earning now, projected over a year. Where our bonds are quite literally, that's the APY you'll get over the whole year, And so I think people who are just holding assets at rest are buying them. We also have like a lot of application partners, application developers. So we have stablecoin issuers who I'll just shout a team out there, Brel. They're basically a US regulated stablecoin issuer. They would never be able to issue a Mexican peso because they aren't regulated for that. But since they've integrated with stable bonds, they can now issue stable coins denominated in the peso using us. So application developers, people just holding and using kind of like an alternative asset as an investment instead of the meme coins for the moment.
For a long time, like, people were quite concerned about US, stable coins. And then all of a sudden, they're one of the largest holders of US treasuries. And so they're quite intertwined right now. Right. And so the more overall usage that happens in crypto and even in Bitcoin, when you're buying and selling, you're moving it back into stable coins, which then is ultimately driving, in many cases, US treasuries. So it's fascinating how closely this gets, intertwined and actually at the institutional and sort of the sovereign or nation state level. You kind of see that same thing happening in Mexico and other emerging markets, because it's blown up on the US side, much bigger than I think people imagine, right? But like, what happens in these other countries?
Yeah, I think there will be a lagging indicator. So just like there was in the US. So it was almost fascinating to see the US's initial response to be against stablecoins. because it was almost a guaranteed way to ensure dollar dominance around the world. Like the ease of use of a US dollar denominated stablecoin in Nigeria is like insanely easy now through Tether and other things like that. Where the US on its own could not have penetrated those markets. And there's a lot of sovereign nations who actively fight against that. They try to find a way, how do we stop foreign government, our people from holding money in foreign governments because it doesn't benefit us. It's been very strange to see the US fight so hard to not win absolute US dominance around the world and not understand like what's happening. And now it's pretty clear, like if things keep going the direction they're going, like the US will be like the dominant source of payment across the world because stablecoins are such a better interface and such a more intuitive interface. So I think the lagging indicator is emerging markets in other countries are starting to wake up. And this has happened before. So like in Mexico, there's a thing called the tequila crisis where the only thing they called it that because like the only thing that had value was tequila at one time because their economy was dollar denominated, but it was like a hard time. And Mexico had to create laws saying you can only purchase stuff with pesos. So most countries have these, right? Defensive kind of legal things where if you want to invest in the stock exchange in Japan or Mexico, you have to use pesos. And that's to enforce their own currency in those markets. We think and that soon countries will do things similar and they're going to need a place to go to provide that service. And we think that, we're kind of showing these places. There is some unfairness, where if your economy is creating crazy volume and value and all that wealth is going to a different country, to a company, that's probably not the best outcome for the world.
Yeah, I guess that's the dollar milkshake theory, right? And then
yes.
The deeper focus is there a Bitcoin milkshake that just Bitcoin ends up eating everything. But that's for a different podcast, I suppose.
For sure. And that'll happen too.
It's the podcast Jeremy wishes he had.
We respect everyone equally. We just have preferences. That's all.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But I guess what I'm saying is I think the lagging, like soon you'll start to see these nations wake up and say, we need our own, and it'll be too late. Yeah. It'll be too late. And so hopefully we can help some people be competitive and hopefully Mexico will see the value we brought,
Where does it go next? I think the one that, in kind of my world, in the Bitcoin side, the Bitcoin bonds that El Salvador were doing, we're driving a lot of like publicity, in that space. But like, where do you broadly see sort of, nationalizing bonds and putting them on chain, like beyond Mexico? What else is the opportunities? Is it just the global South in general? Is there certain countries that are more likely to, sort of digitize their debt?
I think the bond market today is huge. So the total bond market was like 4 trillion. I wrote the number down, but it's 4.5 times the US economy. I think the whole bond market in the next 15 years will move on chain. If you look at people who've put bonds on chain, it's like as Franklin Templeton said, it's a 30,000x improvement over how we do things today. So next is everything will be settled on chain. The company, I think, Jeremy, you're related. The company we worked on before this was Neural Payments, which is all about moving money in the US from point A to point B. How that happens today is so inefficient compared to a wallet with some private key transaction sent from one person to the next. It's so much better that it's inevitable that the financial world starts to move on chain. So what I see what's next for us is fundamental financial applications use stable bonds or bond-backed tokens as the basis for many financial applications. So if you have a social media account and you want to facilitate the sending of money between those folk, you'll use your own kind of stable coin, which uses bonds as collateral. And so that yield is now in your revenue stream. I see the foreign exchange markets moving on chain because DeFi is so much more efficient than this kind of like physically limited OTC counter cross-country exchange, right? Exchanging between Mexican bonds and a US bond for us is essentially free. It's just spot pricing. So I think if we're not too early, you will see the world move on chain, and we might be a big part of that.
Digitizing, a product that's well known, on in the bond space and treasury bills is one thing, but you're describing this, inference when stablecoin becomes payment infrastructure,
Yeah.
right? And if that's backed by treasury bonds, I guess the question, like, there's a little bit of worry to me on, like, if what we're doing is growing the volume of payment flow in digital GDP, is that actually increasing or enabling more debt? And is that a good thing? Like, it's one thing to just digitize the debt that's already occurring. It's another question for me of, like, okay, well, if all Visa and MasterCard went to a stable coin, like, are we just sort of enabling, maybe some cases we don't want to enable. So like, what happens, at the end of this if this becomes 100% ubiquitous?
Yeah, I think there's good debt and bad debt, and I would say this would be good debt. So this debt is always already inherent. So right now we have bonds as a funding mechanism, but then we also have money that we print, right? And so to facilitate commerce, right now we're just printing money. It's not necessarily backed by anything. I guess my hope for the future is that we enable like a locality to minutely redirect the value that a community's created back to some fundraising mechanism to improve that community. I think we're taking out the need for just printing money, and we're essentially collateralizing all our money based off of some debt that I think, the most part, it's the best type of debt a country can issue. And then if a country has their act together, they use those funds to improve their community. So it all depends. It depends if this new mechanism for fundraising debt is used responsibly or not.
I love this. I was not expecting a conversation about the tokenization of sovereign debt to be a warm, fuzzy episode, but here we are.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you have to be unreasonably optimistic to be a founder, or
Yeah.
else you'll just die of pressure. And so I think our goal is essentially to create a better way and to facilitate payments and commerce, and to remove all barriers of access from bond yields to a product and a consumer. It's really weird how hard it is for, let's say, a poor person to buy a bond compared to a lottery ticket. It's like the most insane thing in the world. And with this, it's actually easier to buy this, especially once we have adoption, you know? It will be as easy or easier to buy a very wise investment vehicle as when compared to a lottery ticket.
We'll let history decide on whether or not treasury bills or Bitcoin's going to end up winning, but that's a
Yeah.
different episode too.
Yeah, we'll see.
but
We'll
but
see.
so, like, I guess the one of the more interesting things to me is, like, you as a good founder does, you went for where's their opportunity, and where's the art of possible. And so, Mexico is a place where you felt like, you had favorable regulatory and sort of policy conditions. In the prior administration's SEC, which was quite hostile, right? And, the feds and other folks, it was almost impossible to do products like this in the US. They literally sued a number of founders that were, operating broadly in this space. And then the larger ones that were roughly working it had to be so large and so sort of institutionally connected, that they were sort of able to weather that. But now you have a completely, at least in the US, different administration. When you have Treasury Secretary, Commerce Secretary, the head of the SEC, like, all of these folks have a very different sort of regulatory and policy framework. I think about both US dollar dominance, and crypto and Bitcoin strategic reserves and all of these things. Like, how do you see the tailwinds for the change in the US regulatory side, like, affecting kind of the broader space?
I think at this point, it's political suicide to probably create any policy that is negative towards stablecoins or something close. And we have our regulatory kind of runway in Mexico is not just to tokenize sovereign debt, but we actually started with that because it is the strongest argument we could make for a good idea when compared to like an equity or something like that. And that's primarily driven, even though we're a Mexican company, by the fact that we are US people and we felt the SEC of the United States would still come after us if we started with some other asset. So I'm very excited for some clarity in the space. We don't issue any directly to at all. I guess to be safe, I should say we do not interface at all with U.S. persons. So U.S. persons cannot mint or redeem apps from us. With some guidance from the U.S., we would love to open that space up and enter into these markets and bring this value back to U.S. persons. I think there were people who did start in the US. And like you're saying, the institutional players were like Franklin Templeton, BlackRock, but they still have these weird limitations that stop them from being super successful, especially when looking at retail. And the ones who did start here, I think will end up in a bad spot because of some historical problems and that were unclear for them. And they're great people, but I think they're going to have to account for, the ghosts of our past, and so I regret that. I wish it was a better place for us to innovate these last 4 years, but I think the next 5, we might see some ability for us to enter the US market.
How do you think about kind of the retail space from that perspective? I mean, I think some of the opposition historically uh, has come from a fear that people didn't have, adequate information, and gets back to part of the debate about whether it's a security or not, right? What do you need to do as far as transparency, as far as KYC, all those things to make sure that the people in your ecosystem who are investing really understand what they're getting, and that there will be bad actors in the space. There have been bad actors in the space. We've seen that already. Um, how have you guys kind of thought about that as you've started to build the business?
I think because we've survived the absolute worst of crypto possible, like I closed my seed round 6 days before FTX crash, so like it's been absolutely insane, we have had to prove ourselves through transparency. So I think we probably go do 100x what a lottery ticket does to inform you on what you're doing. So we have third party weekly attestations that our reserves are at least 100 plus collateralized. We have a lot of information on where your assets are custodied, from whom, on our site. So you definitely would have a hard argument to say you did not know what you're getting into. But second to that, I don't think you need to say much. It is as safe. It's as safe of an investment as there is. So, I mean, I think if I walk into Circle K, I can buy a lottery ticket. That's absolutely a dumb idea for someone with very little wealth to purchase. So, I think the the expectation on how much we should be informed should actually be on the government to say. We're guessing at how to best communicate what we're doing. And I think there should be some pressure on them to make the requirements for what we need to do equivalent to other things like lottery tickets, cigarettes, things like that, which are bad ideas compared to buying a bond.
If someone just realized it was directly a bond, that's probably more clear. To your point, it's 100% collateralized. But I think the stablecoin side, there was a lot of uncertainty by the providers, right? And so a lot of where their uncertainty probably lives is if you're one of the larger stablecoin issuers and it's not 100% collateralized, but using commercial paper, in places in Asia, there was rightfully so a lot of concern around systemic risk around stablecoins, which I think has probably some brand overlay in which you guys are trying to do. I think the thing that's changed is now you have direct relationships with the U.S. government. I mean, my observation behind closed doors and watching that space was you had folks like the largest and the second largest who they weren't over collateralized, let's say, and then all of a sudden backroom deals happen with the government, and folks like Cantor Fitzgerald like actually helps collateralize the stable coins, and so that stabilizes the ecosystem. But there was for a considerable amount of time systemic risk. And maybe the bonds aren't that way, but that's certainly what the basket of collateralization was a question for stablecoins for a long time.
That's a fair point too, because back in the day, an algorithmic stablecoin was held in the same room as like a 1-to-1 USDC or so. So yeah, I that's a fair point. I'm kind of living in this new world where that's just not possible to. It's people are more like worried. They think about that a lot more. So yeah, I think moving forward, there's a lot of eyes on what you're doing, and I think a lot of people have seen. A lot of people have gone to jail for not being transparent and honest. So for us, we're willing to take risk, as far as pushing boundaries and improving things, but we're not willing to take any criminal risk, like we said. And so it's pretty clear now what will get you in a lot of trouble. And some of those old stable coins like Terra Luna, they really created a lot of problems for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've got too much like PTSD and brain damage from those criminals. But yeah, so I think like okay, so this is super cool and hopefully is pretty clear and transparent around bonds. But then like the I guess maybe as we wrap, like where do you see this go forward? Like in real world assets in general, there's all kinds of bonds. There's not just sovereign debt bonds, right? Like so like how do you see the next stage of this now that you're seeing both an opening with, the government in Mexico that you're working with, changes in the US policy, like what happens next beyond sovereign debt?
I think we'll start to see other debt types, safer debt types like ETFs. I think we'll see like decentralized indexes. So once we start to put something like, Tesla and Nvidia on chain, you'll start to see algorithmic indexes that kind of just say, this is performing better. So this is the S&P 500 coin, kind of like Coinbase did. But I think also the next step after that is to issue directly on chain. So no paper behind it. You have kind of more a verified issuer and somebody, so there's no need to have collateral, but it's essentially saying this is a verified issuer and this is the same thing as a bond. And I think that's where we're going. El Salvador's done that. But I think there's a lot of trust that needs to be built before we get there. But that'll be next. But primarily what I think we'll see is we'll start to see every application be built on top of these things. So if you look in crypto today, everything's a fee, right? And so that passes on some like burden onto the user. Well, once we've unlocked yield to everybody, I think the market's going to compete to reduce fees to zero because applications now are able to rely on yield as a revenue source. So I think it's going to be better for users. I think it's going to be better for developers. And I think this access is only a good thing.
Yeah, and I'm interested in sort of, high grade bonds as like maybe a next step. I spend my world in the corporate and the enterprise side. So like I think the two areas that are really fascinating right now is obviously there's a lot of treasury allocation discussions going on around, Bitcoin and corporate use, and then like how much is, in corporate treasury. And then, at what point do corporate bonds themselves, go on chain is really fascinating to me. So, I think the more stable stuff's going to happen first on the national side, but yeah.
And the US is floating the idea of having 0% tax on crypto issued bonds. So my guess is corporate debt will go on chain right around then. If there's zero tax, no one's ICOing. No one's IPOing anymore. Everyone's ICOing. So we'll see what happens. Our regulators, our overlords will tell us what to do. So we'll hopefully.
Or not.
Or not,
All right. Well, this was awesome. It's so fascinating how like the worlds of sovereign debt, the debt ceiling, the debt trap, and then digitizing something like as basic for me as my grandfather giving me a $50 T-bill, right, is now being digitized and hopefully opening up commerce for, emerging markets is so cool. So this has been like a rad episode, Dave. Like, where can people find you if they want to either discover to use the product, I guess, if you're not in the US today, or just like read about or hear more? Where are you online, man?
The best place to find information about us is etherfuse.com. We're also on Twitter, EtherFuse. And so those are probably the best places. And depending on who you are, you'll be able to access the platform. And people, are working toward environment enables secondary markets, not us directly, but we're also in a lot of DeFi ecosystems too. So check us out and let me know if you have any questions.
Super cool, Dave. Thank you so much for joining us.
I love it. I love it. That's a wrap, guys. If you want to keep following us, hit like, hit subscribe, all that stuff you're supposed to do on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and wherever the hell else podcasts are at. We'll catch you on the next episode. Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Megan. Cheers.